The fluorescent lights in the county building hummed with the same flat indifference they had hummed with for 18 years. Wren Holloway stood in the lobby, her faded backpack slung over one shoulder, watching dust motes drift through a slant of morning sun. The caseworker across from her smiled the kind of smile that had been rehearsed 1,000 times before. Polite, professional, already thinking about the next file on her desk. It was a Tuesday, a bright, wind-scoured Tuesday in early March. The kind of day that should have felt like a beginning. Instead, it felt like being pushed off a cliff with a parachute no one had bothered to check. "These are your documents," the caseworker said, sliding a thin manila envelope across the counter. "Birth certificate, social security card, medical records. There's a prepaid debit card in there too, $847. Wren took the envelope. It weighed almost nothing. 18 years of existing in the system. And this was what she had to show for it. A few sheets of paper, a plastic card, the clothes on her back, and whatever fit in the backpack she'd carried from foster home to foster home since she was 6 years old. "There's one more thing," the caseworker added, her tone shifting slightly. Curious now, maybe even a little confused. "A property deed, notarized, transferred to your name upon your 18th birthday. Wren blinked. "A what?" The caseworker pulled out a separate document older than the others, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. "It appears you've inherited land, an apple orchard outside Paonia. That's in western Colorado, about 5 hours from here." Wren stared at the deed like it might bite her. Paonia. She knew that name. It lived somewhere deep in her memory, buried under layers of foster homes and group houses, and the careful numbness she had learned to wrap around herself like armor. "Who left it to me?" The caseworker checked her notes. "A Miriam Holloway, your maternal grandmother. She passed away 8 years ago, but the deed was held in trust until you turned 18. Miriam, the name hit Wren like a punch to the sternum. She remembered Miriam, or she remembered pieces of her anyway. The smell of apple blossoms, a kitchen with yellow curtains, rough weathered hands lifting her onto someone's hip, a voice humming something slow and sweet while the sun went down. And then nothing. One day Wren had been in that kitchen, safe and warm and loved. The next day she was in a stranger's car, clutching a trash bag full of clothes, watching the orchard disappear through the back window. She had been 6 years old. She had never seen Miriam again. "She left me land," Wren said flatly. The words tasted wrong in her mouth. Bitter. "She couldn't be bothered to visit me once in 12 years, but she left me land." The caseworker's smile flickered uncertain. "I'm sure there were circumstances." "Yeah." Wren folded the deed and shoved it into the envelope with everything else. "There always are." She walked out of the county building without looking back. The automatic doors hissed shut behind her, and just like that, she was no longer a ward of the state. She was a legal adult, free to go wherever she wanted, free to sleep wherever she could find a spot, free to starve if she couldn't figure out how to eat. The morning air smelled like exhaust and dry pavement baking under the high desert sun. Wren stood on the cracked concrete steps, squinting against the glare, feeling both utterly exposed and completely invisible at the same time. This was independence. This was what she had waited 18 years for. It felt like standing on the edge of a vast, empty parking lot with no idea which direction led anywhere worth going. Her phone buzzed before noon. Wren was sitting on a bench outside a gas station eating a granola bar she'd bought with her new debit card, trying to figure out her next move. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered anyway. When you owned almost nothing, every call could be an opportunity. Or a trap. "Miss Holloway." The voice on the other end was smooth, confident, the voice of someone used to getting what they wanted. "My name is Preston Marsh. I'm a land acquisitions officer with Titan Agri Holdings." Wren frowned. "How did you get this number?" "Public records, inheritance filings. We like to stay informed about property transfers in our operational areas." A pause just long enough to feel deliberate. "I understand you've recently come into possession of the Holloway Orchard outside Paonia. I've come into possession of a piece of paper that says I own it. I haven't even seen the place. That's actually why I'm calling." Preston's tone warmed, turning sympathetic. Understanding. "Miss Holloway, I'll be honest with you. That property has been abandoned for nearly a decade. The infrastructure is failing. The trees are dead or dying. The land itself may not even be suitable for agriculture anymore. Wren watched a truck pull into the gas station, its engine rumbling low and tired. And you're calling to tell me this out of the goodness of your heart? A small, polished laugh. I'm calling because Titan is prepared to make you an offer. $8,000 for the property as is. You wouldn't have to do anything except sign the paperwork. The money would be in your account within the week. $8,000. Wren's breath caught. To someone who had slept in a shared group homeroom just days ago, $8,000 was more money than she had ever imagined having at once. It was rent, a used car, community college tuition, a chance at something resembling a normal life. Why, she asked. If the land is worthless, why do you want it? We're consolidating holdings in the region, streamlining operations. It's more about the acreage than the orchard itself. Preston's voice stayed smooth, reasonable. Frankly, Miss Holloway, we'd be doing you a favor. That property is a liability, not an asset. It'll cost you more to maintain than you could ever hope to earn from it. Wren stared at the mountains, faint and blue in the distance. She tried to picture the orchard, tried to remember anything concrete about the place she had been taken from 12 years ago. All she could summon was the smell of apple blossoms and a pair of rough hands, and the question that had burned in her chest for more than a decade. If Miriam had loved her, why hadn't she fought to keep her? If she hadn't loved her, why leave her anything at all? I'm not selling, Wren heard herself say. Not yet, not until I see it. There was a pause on the line, brief, calculated. Of course, Preston said, his tone unchanged. Take your time. But Miss Holloway, our offer won't stand forever. The market isn't kind to sentimental delays. The line went dead. Wren sat on the bench for a long time after that, the phone warm in her hand, the mountains watching her from the edge of the skate. $8,000 was life-changing money. Walking away from it was probably stupid. Everything logical, everything practical, everything she had learned about survival in 18 years of the system told her to take the offer and run. But something else, something stubborn and raw and not quite dead, told her to wait. She stood up, shouldered her backpack, and walked 3 blocks to the Greyhound station. One ticket to Paonia, she said to the clerk behind the counter. One way. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being placed somewhere. She wasn't being moved by caseworkers or foster parents or judges. She was choosing where to go. The Greyhound dropped Wren at a sun-bleached stop outside Paonia just after 3 in the afternoon. The bus pulled away in a cloud of diesel exhaust, leaving her standing on the shoulder of the highway with her backpack and the thin manila envelope that contained everything she owned. The town sat in a valley cupped between low ridges and the distant blue suggestion of the West Elk Mountains. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been holding its breath for 50 years, waiting for something to change, slowly accepting that nothing would. A feed store with a faded John Deere sign, a diner advertising green chili burgers and homemade pie, pickup trucks angled along Main Street like they'd been parked there since 1987, and everyone had simply agreed to leave them alone. Wren walked into town, her boots scuffing against cracked pavement. People glanced at her the way small-town people always glanced at strangers. Curious, cautious. Not unfriendly exactly, but not welcoming either. She stopped at the diner to ask for directions. The cashier, a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, looked at her with mild surprise when Wren mentioned the Holloway orchard. That old place. The woman's eyebrows rose. Honey, I thought nobody owned it anymore. It's been sitting empty for years. My grandmother left it to me. Something shifted in the woman's expression. Recognition, maybe, or memory. You're Miriam's granddaughter. Wren nodded. The woman studied her for a long moment, her eyes searching Wren's face like she was looking for something specific. Whatever she found there, she didn't share it. It's about 12 miles out, she said, finally pulling out a napkin and sketching a rough map. Take the county road north past the irrigation ditches. You'll see a mailbox that used to be painted blue. Probably just rust now. Turn there. The house is at the end of the drive. Wren thanked her and turned to leave. Hey, the woman's voice stopped her at the door. Your grandmother was a good woman. Don't let anyone tell you different. Wren didn't know what to say to that. She nodded once and walked out into the afternoon sun. 12 miles is a long walk when you're carrying everything you own on your back. Wren followed the county road north past stretches of brittle grassland and irrigation ditches running low. The sun beat down with the particular intensity of high desert afternoon, dry and relentless. Her shadow stretched long and thin beside her, a silent companion that didn't ask questions or offer opinions. She passed a few houses set back from the road behind fences and windbreaks. An old man on a tractor raised a hand as she walked by. She raised hers in return. That was the extent of their interaction. By the time she reached the rusted mailbox, the sun was starting its slow descent toward the mountains. The mailbox had indeed been blue once. Now it was mostly brown and orange flaking paint revealing bare metal beneath. The name Holloway was barely visible, the letters faded to ghosts. Wren turned down the dirt drive. The first thing she noticed was the silence. No hum of sprinklers, no rustle of healthy leaves, just wind pushing through dry branches, making a hollow rattling sound that raised the hair on her arms. The orchard spread out before her like something from a cautionary tale. Row after row of apple trees, or what had once been apple trees. Now they were just gnarled trunks and brittle limbs, bark split and peeling from years of drought and neglect. Some had fallen entirely, their root systems exposed like the bones of buried giants. Others leaned against each other, too tired to stand alone. It looked less like a farm and more like a graveyard. The farmhouse sat at the end of the drive, and it wasn't in much better shape. White paint long surrendered to sun, and weather hung in curls and strips from the wooden siding. The porch steps swagged in the middle, worn down by decades of footsteps that had stopped coming. A barn stood nearby its door, hanging crooked on one hinge, darkness visible through the gap. Wren stopped at the edge of the orchard, her chest tight. This was it. This was what Miriam had left her. Not a legacy, not a future. Just a dead orchard and a dying house and 12 years of unanswered questions. $8,000 suddenly seemed generous. She walked between two rows of trees, boots crunching over hard-packed soil that hadn't seen real moisture in years. She crouched down and pressed her palm against the ground. It felt hot and stubborn, like it had forgotten how to be soft, like it had given up on the possibility of rain. A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. She had hitchhiked her hope on this place. She had turned down $8,000 because some sentimental part of her, some foolish childish part that should have died years ago in the system, had believed there might be something here worth fighting for. There wasn't. There was just death and dust and the wind making that horrible rattling sound through the dead branches. Wren stood up, wiping her hand on her jeans. She walked through what used to be the center row, trying to match memory to reality. She remembered being small enough that the grass had once brushed her knees. She remembered sunlight filtering through thick green leaves, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. She remembered reaching up, 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 and someone lifting her so she could pick an apple straight from the branch. She remembered feeling safe. Now the branches scratched against her flannel shirt like dry bones, and safety felt like a foreign language she had forgotten how to speak. She left me this, Wren muttered to the empty orchard. 12 years of nothing, and then she left me this. The anger rose sharp and familiar, the same anger that had gotten her through foster homes and group houses and all the small cruelties of a system that processed children like paperwork. The anger that kept her moving when everything else wanted to stop. Maybe Preston Marsh was right. Maybe the land wasn't viable anymore. Maybe Miriam had run out of money, out of hope, out of options, and this was the only thing she had left to give. Or maybe she had simply run out of love. The inside of the house was worse than the outside suggested. Dust coated everything in a thin, patient layer, the kind that accumulated over years of neglect. The kitchen sink was dry, the pipes beneath it visible through gaps in the cabinet doors. The refrigerator door hung open, its shelves empty, its motor long since silent. A calendar from 8 years ago still clung to the wall, curled at the corners, frozen on a month that Miriam would never finish, March. The same month Wren had just lived through 18 years of. She wondered if Miriam had died in March, if they shared that at least. A month of endings. Wren dropped her backpack on the floor and sat at the small wooden table in the center of the kitchen. It wobbled under her weight, one leg shorter than the others, a problem that had apparently never been fixed. She tried to imagine Miriam here alone, winter storms rolling through the valley, bills stacking up on this table, silence pressing in from the dead orchard outside. Had she been scared? Had she been lonely? Had she thought about the granddaughter she had given up somewhere out there in the system growing up without her? If she had loved Ren, why hadn't she come back? The thought hit harder here in the emptiness of this kitchen than it had anywhere else. For 12 years, Ren had carried the story of being unwanted like armor. It protected her. It explained why she had been left behind, why no one had chosen her, why she had bounced from home to home without ever finding a place to land. She was unlovable. She had been abandoned. That was the truth she had built herself around. But sitting in Miriam's kitchen, surrounded by 8 years of dust and silence, Ren felt the first cracks forming in that armor. Because this didn't look like the house of someone who hadn't cared. This looked like the house of someone who had been alone for a very long time. And loneliness, Ren knew, was not the same as indifference. Isham. By nightfall, the temperature dropped fast. Desert cold replaced desert heat, and Ren understood for the first time why the high country was called a cold desert. The warmth of the day disappeared like it had never existed, and the darkness brought with it a chill that cut straight through her flannel shirt. She found a camping lantern in the barn, the battery somehow still functional despite years of neglect. She lit it and carried it back to the house, its weak yellow glow pushing back the shadows that had crept in through the windows. The couch in the living room was dusty but intact, the cushions sunken from years of use. Ren dragged a blanket from the bedroom, shook out the dust, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She sat on the porch steps, the lantern beside her, and stared at the dead orchard under a wide scatter of stars. She had never seen so many stars. In the cities and suburbs of her foster care years, the sky had always been washed out by light pollution, a pale imitation of what the night was supposed to look like. Here, away from everything, the Milky Way stretched across the blackness like a river of light, and Ren felt very small. Small and alone, and entirely uncertain about what came next. She pulled out her phone and stared at the missed call notification from Preston Marsh. $8,000. A ticket out of here. A fresh start somewhere that didn't smell like dust and failure. Tomorrow morning, she told herself. She would call him tomorrow morning. She would take the money. She would leave this dry, broken place behind and never look back. It was the smart move. The logical move. The move that made sense for a homeless 18-year-old with no skills, no connections, and no reason to believe she could turn a dead orchard into anything worth having. The wind moved through the orchard again, low and restless, making that hollow rattling sound through the dead branches. It sounded almost like a voice, Ren thought, like something trying to speak but not quite managing the words, like something refusing to stay buried. She went inside and lay down on the couch, the blanket pulled up to her chin, the lantern casting flickering shadows on the ceiling. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the creaks and groans of a house settling around her. But when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of apple blossoms and rough hands and a voice singing something she almost remembered. Ren woke before sunrise, stiff and cold, and half convinced she had made a mistake. The desert morning was deceptively gentle. Pale gold light stretched across the orchard, softening the dead branches, almost making them look alive from a distance. For one brief, irrational moment, she wondered if she had exaggerated the damage in her head. If maybe in the daylight, things wouldn't look so hopeless. She walked to the window and looked out. She hadn't exaggerated anything. The orchard was just as dead in the morning light as it had been the evening before. The trees were still skeletal, still broken, still bearing the unmistakable marks of years without care. The only difference was that now she could see it all more clearly. Every crack in every trunk, every fallen branch, every patch of soil baked so hard it looked like clay. By 8 o'clock, the sun was already climbing toward its midday intensity, and Ren knew the heat would follow. She moved through this kitchen, opening cabinets more out of restlessness than any real purpose. Most were empty. A few held old canning jars, their contents long since evaporated or spoiled, a rusted can opener, a stack of yellowed seed catalogs, the pages stuck together with age. She told herself she was just killing time, just looking around before she called Preston Marsh and accepted his offer. Just giving herself one last morning in the house where Miriam had lived before she closed this chapter of her life forever. That was when her boot heel caught on a loose board near the sink. The plank shifted beneath her weight, and there was a sound, a hollow metallic thud like something empty underneath the floor. Ren froze. She had walked across this kitchen a dozen times since arriving, but she had been distracted, tired, overwhelmed. She hadn't noticed the slight give in the floorboards, the almost imperceptible unevenness that suggested something beneath the surface. She crouched down, her heart suddenly beating faster than it had any reason to. The board was warped at one edge just enough to get her fingers under. She pried at it carefully, half expecting it to crumble in her hands. Instead, it lifted cleanly, revealing a narrow gap beneath. And in that gap, covered with a fine layer of dust, but otherwise intact, was an iron hatch. The handle was flush with the floor, designed to stay hidden. If the board hadn't shifted, if her boot hadn't caught at exactly the wrong angle, she might never have found it. Wren's pulse quickened, cautious, skeptical, unwilling to hope for anything but unable to stop the hope from rising anyway. She grabbed the handle and pulled. It resisted for a moment, stuck with rust and disuse. Then it gave with a dry, groaning sound, and cool air rose from the darkness below. Air that smelled of earth and age and something else, something chemical and sharp that Wren didn't immediately recognize. There was a ladder, wooden rungs leading down into the dark. Wren pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing concrete walls, a floor maybe 10 feet below, and what looked like shelving along the edges. A root cellar, she thought. Old farmhouses often had them. Places to store vegetables and preserves through the winter before refrigeration made such things unnecessary. But something about this didn't feel like a root cellar. She descended the ladder slowly, the rungs creaking under her weight, the phone flashlight sweeping back and forth. The cool air wrapped around her, a relief after the dry heat above, and the smell grew stronger. Soil and minerals and that sharp chemical scent that she now recognized as something like fertilizer or growth medium. Her boots hit concrete and she turned around. What she saw made her stop breathing. This wasn't storage. This was a laboratory. The walls were lined with metal shelving, and on those shelves sat row after row of glass jars. Not canning jars, not preserves, but laboratory-grade containers with sealed lids and handwritten labels. Each one filled with seeds. Thousands of seeds organized by type and date and variety, cataloged with a precision that spoke of years of careful work. There were humidity meters mounted on the walls, their needles frozen at whatever reading they had last recorded. Soil samples sealed in plastic bags, each one marked with coordinates and depth measurements. Binders stacked neatly on a long metal table, their spines labeled in handwriting that Wren recognized with the start. Miriam's handwriting. She moved through the space like she was walking through a dream. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't a casual interest in gardening or farming. This was research. Serious, methodical, scientific research conducted in secret beneath a farmhouse that looked abandoned and worthless to anyone who didn't know to look beneath the floor. The binders contained data, charts and graphs and observations recorded over years, maybe decades. Growth rates, drought resistance, crossbreeding experiments, soil composition analyses. It was the kind of work that required patience and expertise and a level of dedication that bordered on obsession. On the far end of the table, separate from everything else, sat a small wooden box. Cedar, Wren thought, from the faint scent that still clung to it. The wood was worn smooth with handling and carved into the lid in letters that had been traced over and over until they were deep and certain was a name. Wren Holloway. Her hands shook as she reached for it. The box was heavier than it looked. She lifted the lid, and inside, nestled in cloth that might have once been velvet, were two items. A thick notebook bound in leather, its pages dense with handwriting and pressed specimens. And a letter folded once, the paper slightly yellowed, but still crisp. Wren set the notebook aside and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Strong but slightly slanted, the way Wren remembered from birthday cards that had arrived sporadically during her first few years in foster care before stopping entirely. She had forgotten about those cards until this moment, had assumed they meant nothing, had told herself they were obligations, not affection. Now, standing in a secret laboratory beneath a dead orchard, she wasn't sure what they had meant at all. She started to read. My dearest Wren, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain in person. I always hoped I would. I planned for it. I worked toward it every single day for 8 years. But plans don't always survive, and hope isn't always enough. And if you're holding this letter, it means my body gave out before my work was done. I need you to understand something, and I need you to understand it completely, because I know what you must think of me. I know the story you've been carrying for 12 years. I know you believe I abandoned you. I didn't. What I did was worse in some ways and better in others, and I have spent every day since then trying to make it right. When you were 6 years old, I was diagnosed with a heart condition that required surgery and long-term treatment. The bills were enormous. I was already struggling to keep the orchard alive after 3 years of drought. I had no savings, no insurance, no family to turn to. The bank was threatening foreclosure. The medical debt collectors were calling every day. I went to court not because I wanted to give you up, but because a social worker suggested it might be the only way to ensure you received the care and stability you needed. I was broke, Ren. I was sick. I was a 63-year-old woman with a failing heart and a dying farm and no clear path forward. The judge agreed with the social worker. He said you would have better access to health care in state custody, better schools, better opportunities. He said that staying with me with an aging insolvent guardian who might die at any moment would be harmful to your development. I fought. I want you to know that. I fought as hard as I knew how, but I was fighting against a system that had already decided what was best for you, and I was fighting with nothing but love and stubbornness and a stack of overdue bills. I lost. I signed in the papers that gave you up because I believed in that moment that it was the only way to give you a chance. And then I came home to this empty house and I sat at the kitchen table and I cried until I couldn't cry anymore. But I didn't give up. I couldn't come back for you, Ren. The court made that clear. I had surrendered my rights. I was not permitted to contact you, not permitted to visit, not permitted to interfere with your placement. They said it would be confusing for you, destabilizing. They said clean breaks were better. So I did the only thing I could do. I built something for you instead. You're standing in my laboratory. For 12 years, this is where I spent every moment I could spare. Researching, experimenting, developing something that might survive the drought that was killing every farm in this valley. Something that might be valuable enough to give you a real future when you were finally old enough to choose it for yourself. The seeds in those jars are not ordinary seeds. They are the product of more than a decade of work. Crossbreeds and hybrids tested and refined through 12 growing seasons. Drought-resistant apple varieties that can survive on half the water of conventional crops. I have data documentation proof of every step of the process. There are people who want this research. A corporation called Titan Agri-Holdings has been trying to acquire this land for years. They don't want the orchard. They want what's beneath it. They know somehow that I was working on something here. They've made offers. They've made threats. I have refused them all. This research is not for sale. It is for you. If you're reading this letter, it means you've turned 18. It means the trust has released the deed. It means you've found your way back to this place despite everything, and you've discovered what I left behind. I stayed away so you could have a future. I built this so you could choose one. I love you, Ren. I have loved you every single day since the moment you were born, and I have loved you every single day since the moment I let you go. Letting you go was the hardest thing I have ever done. And if there is any justice in this world or the next, I will have the chance to tell you that myself someday. But if I don't, if this letter is all that remains of me, then please know this: you were not abandoned. You were not unwanted. You were loved so fiercely that I sacrificed the only thing I had left, the chance to watch you grow up so that you could have a life worth living. The orchard is yours now. The research is yours. The choice is yours. I believe in you. I always have. Your grandmother, Miriam. Ren couldn't see the words anymore. Tears blurred, the ink ran down her cheeks, dripped onto the concrete floor of the laboratory. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the letter. Her chest felt like something had cracked open inside it, something that had been sealed shut for 12 years. And now all the grief and anger and loneliness she had stored there was pouring out at once. She sank onto the metal stool beside the table, her legs unable to hold her up any longer. The letter crumpled slightly in her grip, and she forced herself to loosen her fingers to smooth out the creases to treat it with the care it deserved. 12 years. For 12 years, she had believed she was unlovable. For 12 years, she had carried the story of a grandmother who walked away, who chose a dying orchard over a living child, who couldn't be bothered to fight for the only family she had left. And it was wrong. All of it was wrong. Miriam hadn't walked away. She had been forced out, pushed aside by a system that thought it knew better by bills and illness and circumstances beyond her control. And instead of giving up, instead of surrendering to the unfairness of it all, She had spent 12 years building something, working alone in this hidden laboratory night after night, season after season, preparing a gift for a granddaughter she wasn't allowed to see. She had died down here, Wren realized. Maybe not literally, but in every way that mattered. She had given the last years of her life to this place, to this work, to the hope that someday, somehow, Wren would find her way back. And she had. She was here. She was reading the letter. She was sitting in the laboratory that Miriam had built for her. 12 years too late, but she was here. Wren picked up the notebook, her hands still trembling, but steadier now. She opened it to the first page and began to read. The notebook was more than a journal. It was a scientific record, meticulous and comprehensive, documenting every step of Miriam's research over more than a decade. It started with observations. Notes about the drought that had been slowly killing the valley since the early 2000s. Rainfall measurements that dropped year after year. Groundwater levels that fell as agricultural operations pulled more and more from the aquifer. Temperatures that rose seasons, that shifted patterns that became unpredictable. Miriam had seen the future clearly, Wren realized. She had understood long before most people were willing to admit it that the old ways of farming were dying, that the water wouldn't last, that survival required adaptation. So she had started adapting. The early entries detailed her experiments with existing drought-resistant varieties. She had purchased seeds from university extension programs, from specialty nurseries, from other farmers who were trying to solve the same problem. She had planted them, observed them, documented their strengths and weaknesses. And when none of them proved sufficient, she had started crossbreeding her own. The work was painstaking. Wren, who had barely passed high school biology, could only grasp the broad strokes of what Miriam had accomplished. But even she could recognize the dedication required, the years of patience, the willingness to fail again and again and keep trying anyway. Each generation of seeds was labeled and stored, the successful traits preserved, the failures analyzed. Miriam had developed a system, a methodology, a process that belonged in a research institution rather than a hidden cellar beneath a crumbling farmhouse. And somehow, against all odds, she had succeeded. The final entries, written in handwriting that grew shakier as the dates progressed, documented a breakthrough. A variety that had survived 3 consecutive years of below-average rainfall, trees that produced fruit with half the water of conventional apples, data that proved conclusively that the crossbreed was viable. She had done it. She had created something valuable, something important, something that could change agriculture in drought-stricken regions across the country. And she had left it all to Wren. The weight of it pressed down on her, enormous and terrifying and somehow impossibly hopeful. This wasn't just an inheritance. This was a mission, a responsibility, a chance to complete what Miriam had started. But it was also a target. Wren remembered Preston Marsh's smooth voice on the phone, the casual offer, the implication that the land was worthless, that she would be doing herself a favor by selling. He had lied. Titan didn't want the orchard because of the acreage. They wanted what was beneath it. They had known about Miriam's research somehow, and they had been waiting patiently for the moment when the property changed hands. They probably assumed an 18-year-old aged out of foster care would take the money without asking questions. They probably assumed she would be desperate enough to sell before she discovered what she actually owned. They had almost been right. Wren closed the notebook and looked around the laboratory with new eyes. The jars of seeds, the data binders, the years of work preserved in careful handwritten notes. It was all here waiting for her exactly as Miriam had promised. But she couldn't protect it alone. She didn't have the knowledge, the resources, the legal standing to defend what Miriam had built against a corporation that had been trying to acquire it for years. She needed help. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before Titan came knocking again. And she needed to decide once and for all whether she was going to run from this fight or stand her ground. Wren climbed the ladder, slowly emerging from the cellar into the bright morning light of the kitchen. The house looked different now, not abandoned but waiting, not dead but dormant, holding its breath until she decided what happened next. She walked to the window and looked out at the orchard. The trees were still skeletal, still broken, still marked by years of neglect. But somewhere in the cellar below, there were seeds that could bring them back. There was research that could change everything. There was proof that her grandmother had loved her. Wren pulled out her phone and looked at the missed call from Preston Marsh. Her thumb hovered over the callback button for a long moment. Then she deleted the number. She wasn't selling. She wasn't running. She wasn't going to let Titan take what Miriam had built, what Miriam had sacrificed 12 years of her life to create. For the first time since she could remember, Wren had something worth fighting for. And she was going to fight. The sun was high, but by the time she finished exploring the cellar, cataloging in her mind everything Miriam had left behind. The jars numbered in the hundreds. The data binders filled an entire shelf. There were notes and maps and soil samples and equipment she didn't recognize but suspected was expensive. This was more than a hobby, more than a side project. This was the work of a lifetime conducted in secret, preserved against the day when someone would come to claim it. Someone like her. Wren sat on the porch steps, the manila envelope from the county building beside her, the notebook from the cellar in her lap. She had read Miriam's letter 3 more times, each reading revealing details she had missed before. The careful explanations, the apologies buried between lines of factual information, the love that suffused every word, even the clinical ones. She had been wanted. She had been loved. She had been thought about and planned for and worked toward for more than a decade. The armor she had built around herself, the story of being abandoned, was cracking apart piece by piece, and beneath it, raw and exposed, was something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. It hurt, that hope. It was terrifying and fragile and entirely dependent on factors she couldn't control. Titan was powerful. She was alone. The orchard was dying, and the research was only valuable if it could be protected, validated, brought to a point where others could use it. She didn't know how to do any of that, but she knew she wasn't going to figure it out sitting on a porch step feeling sorry for herself. Wren stood up, dusted off her jeans, and walked back into the house. She had work to do. The first task was practical, making the house livable enough to stay. Wren spent the afternoon cleaning, sweeping out dust, opening windows to air out the mustiness, checking the plumbing and electrical systems to see what still functioned. The water came back slowly, sputtering brown at first, then clearing to something almost clean. The electricity worked, though. Several outlets sparked when she tested them, and she made a mental note to be careful. She found canned food in the cellar that had somehow survived, sealed tight enough to remain edible. Beans, mostly, and some preserved fruit that she didn't entirely trust. But it was enough for now, enough to keep her going while she figured out her next steps. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains golden pink, Wren stood at the edge of the orchard and made herself look clearly at the task ahead. The trees were dead, most of them anyway. Years of neglect and drought had taken their toll, and no amount of water or care would bring them back. They would need to be cleared, the rows replanted from Miriam's preserved stock. It would take years to see results. Years of work, years of investment, years of waiting. But the seeds were there, the research was there. The foundation existed, waiting to be built upon. Wren thought about the foster homes she had lived in over the past 12 years. The temporary placements, the group houses, the endless cycle of packing and unpacking, and never quite belonging anywhere. She had learned to survive without roots, to float through life, without attachment, to expect nothing, so she could never be disappointed. This was different. This was a place that belonged to her, a history that was hers to claim, a future that was hers to build. And for the first time in her life, she wanted to stay. That night, Wren sat at the kitchen table with Miriam's notebook open in front of her, reading by the light of the camping lantern. Outside, the wind moved through the dead orchard, but it didn't sound hollow anymore. It sounded like breathing, like patience, like something waiting to come alive again. She still didn't know how she was going to do this. She didn't have money, didn't have expertise, didn't have the connections or resources that a corporation like Titan could bring to bear. All she had was a cellar full of seeds, a notebook full of data, and a letter from a grandmother who had believed in her. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Tomorrow she would go back into town. She would find someone who understood the legal situation, who could help her protect what Miriam had built. She would start making calls, asking questions, figuring out what she was up against. And she would not give up. Miriam had spent 12 years working alone in that cellar, never knowing if her granddaughter would even find what she had created. She had sacrificed everything, including the chance to watch Wren grow up, for the hope that someday this moment would arrive. Wren wasn't going to let that sacrifice be for nothing. She closed the notebook and extinguished the lantern. The darkness wrapped around her, soft and quiet, and for the first time since she could remember, it didn't feel threatening. It felt like rest, like permission to stop running, if only for a night. She lay down on the couch, the blanket pulled up to her chin, and listened to the wind moving through the orchard. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, the sound thin and wild in the night air. Wren closed her eyes. She dreamed of apple blossoms, of rough hands lifting her into the branches, of a voice singing something slow and sweet, and this time she almost remembered the words. When she woke the next morning, the sun was streaming through the windows, and she knew exactly what she needed to do. The law office of Garrett Boone sat on Grand Avenue, wedged between a hardware store that had seen better decades and a barbershop that still displayed a rotating pole from sometime in the Kennedy administration. The building itself was old brick, solid and unapologetic, the kind of structure that had been built to last and had kept that promise through drought and recession and all the slow changes that had reshaped small-town America over the past half-century. Wren stood on the sidewalk for a full minute before she pushed open the door. She had found the name in Miriam's notebook. Not in the research sections, but in a brief personal entry near the back, written in handwriting that was shakier than the earlier pages. Garrett Boone, attorney. He knew about the research. He could be trusted. That last part had been underlined twice. The office inside was small but well organized. A reception desk sat empty, a bell and a handwritten sign inviting visitors to ring for assistance. Beyond it, through a frosted glass door, Wren could see the shadow of someone moving. She rang the bell. The shadow paused, then grew larger as footsteps approached. The door opened, and Wren found herself facing a man in his late 60s, maybe older. Silver hair combed neatly back from a weathered face. Wire-rimmed glasses perched low on a nose that looked like it had been broken at least once in his younger years. His eyes were sharp, assessing the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime listening to stories and learning to sort truth from fiction. "Help you?" His voice was measured, neither friendly nor unfriendly. Professional. Wren held up Miriam's notebook. "My name is Wren Holloway. I think my grandmother wanted me to find you." Something shifted in those sharp eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or memory stirring after a long sleep. "Holloway," he repeated slowly. "You're Miriam's granddaughter." "I am." Garrett Boone studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped aside and held the door open wider. "You'd better come in." The inner office was lined with bookshelves, law volumes, and case files in the accumulated paper of a decades-long career. A wooden desk dominated the center of the room, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Behind it, a window looked out on the alley, sunlight filtering through dusty blinds. Garrett settled into his chair and gestured for Wren to take the seat across from him. She did, placing the notebook and Miriam's letter on the desk between them. "I found these in a cellar beneath the farmhouse," she said, "hidden under the kitchen floor." Garrett picked up the notebook, opened it carefully, and began to read. His expression didn't change, but Wren noticed his hands tighten slightly on the pages. He read for a long time, flipping through sections, pausing occasionally to study a particular entry more closely. When he finally looked up, his face had changed. The professional neutrality was gone, replaced by something sharper, more focused. "Do you understand what this is?" he asked quietly. "Research, some kind of drought-resistant apple variety. She worked on it for years." "More than years." Garrett set the notebook down and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Your grandmother was developing something that agricultural corporations have been trying to achieve for decades. A fruit tree variety that can survive extended drought conditions without significant reduction in yield. If this data is accurate, and I have every reason to believe it is, what she created is worth millions." Wren felt the number land somewhere in her chest, heavy and unreal. Millions. At minimum, probably more depending on how the licensing is structured. Garrett replaced his glasses and fixed her with that sharp gaze. "Which is why Titan Agrihold Ings has been trying to acquire your grandmother's property for the past 10 years. They called me the day I got the deed, offered $8,000. A humorless smile crossed Garrett's face. "I'm sure they did. They've been waiting for this moment, waiting for Miriam to bing and the property to pass to someone who didn't know what they were inheriting." "They didn't want the land," Wren said slowly, the pieces clicking together. "They wanted this, the research." "Exactly." Garrett leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Titan has been consolidating agricultural holdings across the western slope for years. They've bought out dozens of struggling farms, absorbed the land, incorporated it into their industrial operations. But your grandmother's property was different. She had something they couldn't just buy or replicate, so they waited. Wren thought about Preston Marsh's smooth voice on the phone, the casual offer, the implication that she would be doing herself a favor by selling. They knew, she said. They knew exactly what was in that cellar. They suspected. Miriam was careful, but rumors spread in small towns. People noticed that she was doing something down there, even if they didn't know exactly what. And Titan has resources, researchers, informants. They've been tracking her work for years, waiting for the chance to acquire it. The weight of it pressed down on Wren, enormous and suffocating. She was 18 years old. She had no money, no education, no experience with anything resembling corporate warfare. And she was sitting across from a lawyer telling her that one of the largest agricultural conglomerates in the region wanted what she had inherited. "What do I do?" she asked, and she hated how small her voice sounded. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up, walked to the door of his office, and closed it. When he turned back, his expression had changed again. Heavier now. Burdened. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "Something I should have told Miriam years ago, but I was too much of a coward." Wren waited, her stomach tightening. Garrett returned to his chair, but he didn't sit down. He stood behind it, his hands gripping the leather, back his knuckles white. 10 years ago, when Titan first started putting pressure on your grandmother, she came to me for advice. She was already struggling then. Medical bills falling, crop prices, the drought getting worse every year. She couldn't afford a real legal battle. She could barely afford to keep the lights on. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was rougher. "I told her to sell. I told her the fight wasn't worth it. I said she was an old woman alone on a dying farm, and there was no point in sacrificing what little time she had left for a piece of land that wouldn't support her anyway." Wren felt something cold spread through her chest. "She didn't listen," Garrett continued. "She told me I didn't understand. She said she was building something important, something that needed to be finished. I thought she was being sentimental, stubborn. I thought she was throwing away her chance at a comfortable ending because she couldn't let go of the past." He met Wren's eyes, and for the first time she saw shame there, raw and undisguised. "I was wrong. I didn't know about the research. Not really. I didn't understand what she was doing or why it mattered. I just saw an old woman fighting a battle she couldn't win, and I gave up on her before she gave up on herself." The office was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a truck rumbled down Grand Avenue, its engine fading into the distance. "She died 8 years ago," Garrett said. "Lone. Still working in that cellar. I heard about it weeks after the funeral from someone who had driven past the property and noticed the mail piling up. By the time anyone checked on her, she had been gone for days." Wren's throat tightened. She thought about Miriam in the farmhouse, surrounded by years of work, waiting for a granddaughter who would never come while she was alive. "I've carried that with me ever since," Garrett continued. "The guilt of giving up on someone who refused to give up on herself. The knowledge that I could have helped, could have fought alongside her, but I chose to walk away because it seemed easier." He finally sat down, the leather creaking beneath his weight. His hands were still shaking slightly. "So when you ask me what you should do, I'm the wrong person to give you advice. I failed your grandmother when she needed me. I don't have any right to tell you what to do with her legacy." Wren looked at him for a long moment. At the guilt etched into his face, the years of regret visible in every line and shadow. She thought about Miriam alone in her cellar, working through the night on research that might never see the light of day. And she thought about herself, 18 years old, homeless, possessing nothing but a deed and a notebook and a letter from a woman who had loved her enough to let her go. "You're wrong," Wren said quietly. Garrett looked up surprised. "You said you don't have any right to tell me what to do, but you're wrong." Wren leaned forward, her voice steady. "You owe my grandmother a fight. You gave up on her 10 years ago, and she died alone because no one stood with her. So now you have a choice. You can keep carrying that guilt for the rest of your life, or you can help me finish what she started." The silence stretched between them, taut and expectant. Garrett stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. Then slowly he nodded. "All right," he said. "All right, let's talk about what we're up against." The next 2 weeks were a blur of paperwork and phone calls, and late nights in Garrett's office, surrounded by legal documents that Wren barely understood. The first step, Garrett explained, was to file for intellectual property protection. Miriam's research needed to be formally documented, her methods and results recorded in a way that would establish clear ownership. It was a process that normally took months, sometimes years, but Garrett knew people, researchers at the State Agricultural Extension Office, patent attorneys who owed him favors, a network of contacts built over decades of small-town practice. He called in every favor he had. Wren, meanwhile, threw herself into making the property functional again. She used the last of her debit card money to buy basic supplies, food cleaning materials, tools. She cleared debris from the porch, patched the worst of the holes in the roof, and spent hours in the cellar organizing Miriam's research into something resembling a coherent archive. The work was exhausting, but it felt good. For the first time in her life, she was building something instead of just surviving. Every nail she hammered, every shelf she organized, every note she transcribed was a step towards something real. It was also a distraction from the fear that coiled in her stomach every time she thought about Titan. The fear turned out to be justified. Exactly 2 days after Garrett filed the preliminary patent paperwork, Wren walked out to check the irrigation lines she had spent the previous day repairing. They had been cut, clean slices through the plastic tubing in 3 separate places along the main line, no footprints nearby, no tire tracks, just damage precise and deliberate, designed to look like it could have been vandalism or wildlife or simple bad luck. Wren stood in the orchard, the morning sun beating down on her shoulders, and understood that the fight had begun. The next attack came through official channels. Garrett called her 3 days later, his voice tight with controlled anger. The county clerk's office had somehow misplaced her patent filing. The paperwork had been received logged and then lost somewhere in the system. No one could explain how it had happened. No one took responsibility. "They're inside the bureaucracy," Garrett said. "Titan has people everywhere. County offices, state agencies, maybe even the courts. They've been operating in this region for decades. They know how to make things disappear." Wren felt the cold spread through her chest again, the same cold that had gripped her when Garrett confessed his failure with Miriam. "So we refile," she said. "We refile, and we make copies, and we send duplicates to every agency that might have jurisdiction. They can't lose all of them." But even as she agreed, Wren understood that they were playing defense. Every move they made, Titan countered. Every step forward, something pushed them back. The pressure wasn't just legal, it was social too. A local blog, one of those small-town news sites that covered everything from high school football to town council meetings, ran a speculative piece about the Holloway property. The article didn't make any direct accusations, but the implications were clear. Questions about whether an 18-year-old foster kid could legitimately claim ownership of valuable agricultural research. Suggestions that the whole thing might be a scam, a fabrication, a desperate grab for attention by someone with no real connection to the land. Wren read the article on her phone, sitting on the porch steps as the sun went down, and felt something harden inside her. They were trying to isolate her, trying to make her seem illegitimate, untrustworthy, unworthy of the inheritance Miriam had left her. If they couldn't take the property directly, they would undermine her standing in the community until no one wanted to help her. It was working too. When she walked into the feed store the next morning, the conversations quieted. People glanced at her and then looked away, their faces carefully neutral. The cashier who had given her directions that first day served her without small talk, without warmth, without the casual friendliness that small towns offered to their own. Wren wasn't their own. She was an outsider, a foster kid, a stranger who had shown up claiming something valuable. And in a community that had learned to be suspicious of outsiders, that was enough to make her suspect. She paid for her supplies and walked out without saying a word. The black SUV appeared on a Friday afternoon. Wren was in the orchard cutting away dead branches with a saw she had found in the barn when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. She straightened up, wiping sweat from her forehead, and watched the vehicle approach. It was expensive. The kind of vehicle that looked out of place on a dirt road, all polished chrome and tinted windows. It pulled to a stop in front of the farmhouse and a man stepped out. Preston Marsh looked exactly like his voice had suggested. Mid-40s, well-groomed, wearing a suit that probably cost more than everything Wren owned. His sunglasses reflected the dead orchard as he surveyed the property, his expression somewhere between pity and amusement. Miss Holloway, he said, his tone pleasant. I thought I'd stop by in person. See how you're settling in. Wren didn't move from where she stood, the saw still in her hand. You could have called. I could have. He took off the sunglasses, revealing eyes that were pale and calculating. But some conversations are better had face to face, don't you think? He walked toward her slowly, his expensive shoes crunching on the dry soil. He looked at the dead trees, the crumbling farmhouse, the general air of decay that hung over everything. It's worse than I expected, he said. The property, I mean. I knew it had been neglected, but this, he shook his head almost sadly, this is going to cost a fortune to rehabilitate, if it can even be rehabilitated at all. That's my problem, not yours. Is it? Preston stopped a few feet away, close enough that Wren could see the careful calculation behind his sympathetic expression. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're in over your head. An 18-year-old girl, no money, no experience, trying to resurrect a dead orchard while fighting a legal battle against one of the largest agricultural companies in the state. He paused, letting the words sink in. That's not a fight, Miss Holloway. That's a slow-motion disaster. And I'm trying to offer you a way out. Wren felt her grip tighten on the saw. Your company cut my irrigation lines. Preston's expression didn't change. That's a serious accusation. Do you have any evidence to support it? Your company lost my patent filing. Bureaucratic errors happen, especially with inexperienced filers. Your company planted that blog article. I can't control what independent journalists choose to write about. They stood facing each other in the dead orchard, the sun beating down the wind, stirring dust around their feet. Preston's smile never wavered. Here's the reality, he said. You can keep fighting. You can spend years in court, drain whatever resources you manage to scrape together, and maybe if you're very lucky, you'll win some minor concession that doesn't actually change anything. Or you can accept our offer. Walk away with money in your pocket. Start fresh somewhere else without this burden hanging over you. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. We've increased the offer, $15,000. That's almost double what we proposed initially. Enough for a security deposit on an apartment, a used car, maybe a semester of community college. He held out the paper. All you have to do is sign. Wren looked at the document. $15,000. It was more money than she had ever imagined having. More than enough to start over somewhere else to build a life that didn't involve fighting a corporation that could crush her without breaking a sweat. She thought about Miriam, about the letter, about 12 years of work in a hidden cellar, all for the hope that someday her granddaughter would come back. Stability, Wren said quietly. Preston's smile widened slightly. Exactly. Stability. For who? The smile faltered. Wren met his eyes, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. You keep talking about what's best for me, about how I should walk away for my own good. But that's not what this is about, is it? You don't care about my stability. You care about what's in that cellar. You care about the research my grandmother spent 12 years developing. Research that's worth millions, according to my lawyer. Preston's expression hardened slightly, the mask of sympathy slipping. And the thing is, Wren continued, I might not have money. I might not have experience. I might be just an 18-year-old foster kid who doesn't know what she's doing. But I know what my grandmother wanted, and she didn't spend the last decade of her life building something just so your company could take it. She pushed the document back toward him without taking it. I'm not selling, not for $8,000, not for $15,000, not for any amount you can offer. So you can get back in your expensive car and drive back to whatever corporate office you came from, and you can tell your bosses that Wren Holloway isn't going anywhere. Preston stared at her for a long moment. Then he folded the document and slipped it back into his jacket, his expression cold. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. A very expensive mistake. Maybe, but it's mine to make. He turned and walked back to the SUV without another word. The engine started, the tires kicked up dust, and then he was gone, leaving Wren alone in the dead orchard with her heart pounding and her hands shaking. She had won that round, but she knew with absolute certainty that the fight was far from over. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in late April. Garrett had warned her not to expect too much. This wasn't a trial, just an initial proceeding to determine whether Wren's patent claim had enough merit to move forward. The bar for success was relatively low, he said. All they needed was to demonstrate that Miriam's research existed, that it was original, and that Wren had a legitimate claim to ownership. It should have been straightforward. It wasn't. The courtroom in Grand Junction was larger than Wren had expected, with high ceilings and wood-paneled walls and an air of institutional authority that made her feel small. Garrett sat beside her at the plaintiff's table, his briefcase open, his notes spread out in careful order. Across the aisle, Titan's legal team occupied a table that seemed designed to intimidate. There were 5 of them. 5 attorneys in expensive suits with leather briefcase and tablets in the easy confidence of people who were used to winning. They barely glanced at Wren as the hearing began. The judge was a woman in her 50s, gray-haired and efficient. She reviewed the preliminary filings, asked a few clarifying questions, and then invited Titan's lead counsel to present his objections. The attorney who stood was tall and thin, with the kind of voice that filled a room without seeming to try. Your Honor, we move to dismiss this claim on the grounds that the petitioner has failed to establish basic evidentiary requirements for intellectual property protection. Garrett started to object, but the judge waved him down. Continue. The petitioner claims that her grandmother, Miriam Holloway, developed a novel agricultural variety over a period of years. However, the evidence submitted consists primarily of handwritten notebooks and informal documentation. There are no peer-reviewed publications, no formal research protocols, no third-party verification of any kind. The attorney picked up a folder from his table. Furthermore, we have serious concerns about the authenticity of these materials. The notebooks could have been written by anyone. There is no chain of custody, no independent verification, no way to confirm that Miriam Holloway was actually the author of this research. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. In short, Your Honor, the petitioner is asking this court to grant intellectual property protection based on nothing more than unverified documents found in a cellar. There are no witnesses who can attest to the research process, no contemporaneous records from independent sources, no evidence that would meet even the most basic standards of scientific authentication. The attorney turned to look at Wren, his expression almost pitying. We understand that the petitioner is young and that she may genuinely believe these documents are authentic, but belief is not evidence, and without evidence, this claim cannot proceed. He sat down. The judge turned to Garrett. Counselor response. Garrett rose, his voice steady despite the odds stacked against them. Your Honor, the evidence submitted clearly demonstrates a sustained research effort spanning more than a decade. The notebooks contain dated entries, detailed observations, and cross-referenced data that would be impossible to fabricate after the fact. The handwriting has been verified by comparison with other known samples of Miriam Holloway's writing. The research methodology, while informal, is consistent with established agricultural practices. He paused. As for third-party verification, we have submitted a preliminary evaluation from the Colorado State University Extension Office confirming that the seed varieties documented in these notebooks represent a genuine scientific achievement. The research is real, the results are verifiable, and the petitioner, as the sole heir to Miriam Holloway's estate, has a legitimate claim to ownership. It was a good argument. Wren could see that the judge was listening carefully, weighing the points on both sides. But Titan's attorney wasn't finished. Your Honor, if I may address the verification claim. The judge nodded. The evaluation from Colorado State was conducted on seed samples, not on the notebooks themselves. It confirms that the seeds exist, not that Miriam Holloway created them. For all we know, those seeds could have been purchased from any number of sources and falsely attributed to original research. He straightened his tie, his confidence unshakable. The fundamental problem remains: there are no witnesses. No one who can testify that they saw Miriam Holloway conducting this research. No one who can establish a chain of evidence connecting her to the work described in these notebooks. Without that testimony, the claim is fatally flawed. The judge was silent for a moment, reviewing her notes. When she looked up, her expression was careful. I'm inclined to agree that the evidentiary record is incomplete. However, I'm not prepared to dismiss outright. The preliminary evaluation does suggest that the research has merit. She turned to Wren and Garrett. I'm granting a continuance of 60 days. During that time, the petitioner may supplement the record with additional evidence, including but not limited to witness testimony, expert evaluation, and any other materials that might establish the authenticity and origin of the research in question. She picked up her gavel. If no additional evidence is provided within that period, I will have no choice but to rule in favor of the defendant's motion to dismiss. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. Wren sat frozen in her chair as the courtroom emptied around her. 60 days. She had 60 days to find evidence that might not exist, to produce witnesses who might never come forward, to prove something that Miriam had hidden from the world for more than a decade. Garrett was saying something, his voice low and reassuring, but Wren couldn't hear him. All she could hear was Titan's attorney, his voice echoing in her memory. There are no witnesses. She had lost. The drive back to Paonia felt longer than it should have. Wren stared out the window of Garrett's truck, watching the mountains slide past their peaks, still capped with the snow despite the warming spring. She didn't speak. Garrett didn't push her. When they pulled up to the farmhouse, the sun was setting, painting the dead orchard in shades of gold and amber that almost made it look beautiful. Almost. "We're not done," Garrett said as Wren opened the door. 60 days is enough time to find something. There has to be someone who knew what Miriam was doing. Wren didn't answer. She climbed out of the truck, her boots hitting the gravel with a dull crunch, and walked toward the house without looking back. She heard Garrett's truck pull away, the engine fading into the distance. Then silence broken only by the wind moving through the dead branches. Wren sat on the porch steps, the same steps where she had sat her first night on the property, and let the reality of the situation wash over her. She had failed. Not completely, not yet, but the trajectory was clear. Titan had resources she couldn't match. They had lawyers' influence, a system that worked in their favor. All she had was a notebook, a letter, and a stubborn refusal to give up. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. She thought about calling Preston Marsh, taking the $15,000, walking away before she lost everything. Then she thought about Miriam alone in her cellar, working through the night on research that might never see the light of day, refusing to give up even when everyone told her the fight wasn't worth it. Building something for a granddaughter she wasn't allowed to see, trusting that someday, somehow it would matter. Wren couldn't betray that trust. Not yet. Not while there was still time. But she didn't know what to do next. Peppermint. The knock came just after dark. Wren had moved inside, lighting the camping lantern and sitting at the kitchen table with Miriam's notebook open in front of her, searching for something, anything that might help. She wasn't expecting visitors. The knock was soft, almost hesitant. 3 careful taps on the frame of the screen door. Wren approached cautiously, her hand reaching for the heavy flashlight she kept near the entrance. Through the screen, she could see a figure standing on the porch. An old man, white-haired and weathered, wearing a flannel shirt and work boots that had seen better years. "Who are you?" Wren asked, not opening the door. "Name's Virgil Kincaid." His voice was rough, gravelly, the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. "I live about 2 miles east of here. Been meaning to come by since I heard you were staying." Wren didn't move. "What do you want?" The old man shifted his weight, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He looked uncomfortable, like someone who wasn't used to making social calls. "I knew your grandmother," he said finally. "Knew her for 30 years. Worked alongside her for most of that time." Something shifted in Wren's chest. She opened the screen door. Virgil Kincaid stepped into the light of the lantern, and Wren got her first good look at him. He was in his early 70s, lean and weathered with deep lines carved into his face by decades of sun and wind. His eyes were pale blue, sharp despite his age, and there was something careful in the way he held himself, something guarded. "You're the granddaughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." Virgil nodded slowly, studying her face like he was looking for something specific. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. "I heard about the hearing today. Word travels fast in small towns." He paused. "I also heard they're saying there are no witnesses. Nobody who can prove Miriam did what she did." Wren felt her heart rate quicken. "That's what they're saying." "It's not true." The words hung in the air between them, simple and absolute. "What do you mean?" Wren asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Virgil reached into the inside pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a thick envelope worn at the edges and bent from being carried. "Your grandmother knew they would come eventually, Titan or someone like them. She knew the research was too valuable to stay hidden forever, and she knew that when the time came, she would need proof." He held out the envelope, a palm. "So she prepared, and she asked me to hold on to this until someone came looking for it." Wren took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, she found photographs. Dozens of photographs, each one dated and labeled in Miriam's careful handwriting. The images showed Miriam in the cellar surrounded by her research. Miriam examining seed samples under a magnifying glass. Miriam recording data in the same notebook that now sat on Wren's kitchen table. Miriam older in each successive photo, her hair graying and her posture stooping, but her eyes still sharp, still focused, still determined. The photos spanned years, a decade of work documented in images that showed exactly who had conducted the research and when. Wren looked up at Virgil, her eye blurring it with tears she refused to shed. "Why, wow?" she asked. "Why did she give these to you?" Virgil's weathered face softened slightly. "Because she trusted me. We were neighbors for 30 years. I helped her with the heavy lifting, sometimes collecting soil samples, hauling equipment. I didn't understand all of what she was doing, but I understood that it mattered to her." He paused, his eyes distant. "And because she knew what was coming. The pressure from Titan, the declining health, the isolation. She knew she might not survive long enough to see the research through. So she made backup plans, contingencies. She gave me those photos and told me to keep them safe until someone came looking." Wren looked at the photographs again, at the images of her grandmother working alone in that hidden cellar, year after year building something that no one else believed in. "She knew I would come," Wren said quietly. "She knew I would find the cellar and the research and that I would need this." Virgil nodded. "She talked about you sometimes, not often, but enough. She said you were stubborn like her, said you would fight." Wren thought about the hearing, about Titan's smug attorneys, about the judge's cautious ruling. 60 days to produce evidence. She had 59 days left, and now she had what she needed. "There's more," Virgil said. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I kept copies of some of her notes. The most important ones, the ones that documented her methodology. She said the originals might get lost or destroyed, and she wanted backups in a separate location." He handed over the paper. "Your grandmother was smart, smarter than anyone gave her credit for. And she was patient. She spent 12 years building something, not because she expected to see it succeed, but because she believed it was worth building. She believed in the work, and she believed in you." Wren stood in her grandmother's kitchen, surrounded by evidence that changed everything. The photographs, the backup notes, the testimony of a witness who had known Miriam for 3 decades. She wasn't going to lose. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Virgil shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Don't thank me. Thank your grandmother. She did the hard work. I just held on to some papers." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. That corporation, Titan. They're not going to stop just because you have evidence. They're going to keep pushing, keep trying to wear you down. They've been doing this for years, and they're good at it." His pale eyes met hers. "But so was Miriam. And from what I've seen, so are you." He walked out into the darkness, his footsteps fading into the night. Wren stood in the doorway, the envelope of photographs clutched to her chest, and looked out at the dead orchard. The trees were still skeletal, still broken, still marked by years of neglect. But they weren't hopeless. Not anymore. She had evidence. She had a witness. She had ammunition that Titan didn't know existed. And she had 59 days to use it. Wren walked back to the kitchen table and spread out the photographs, studying each one carefully. Miriam younger in the early photos, her hair still dark, her back still straight. Miriam working through the years, aging and stooping, but never stopping. Miriam in what must have been one of the final photos, gray-haired and tired, but still writing in her notebook, still recording data, still believing. Tears streamed down Wren's face, but she didn't wipe them away. "I'm going to finish this," she whispered to the empty kitchen, to the photographs, to the ghost of the grandmother she had never really known. "I promise. I'm going to finish what you started." Outside, the wind moved through the orchard, rustling the dead branches. But it didn't sound hollow anymore. It sounded like an answer. The weeks that followed Virgil's visit blurred together in a haze of work and preparation, and the slow grinding business of building a legal case from scattered evidence. Garrett threw himself into the effort with an intensity that surprised even Wren. He arrived at the farmhouse most mornings before sunrise, his truck crunching up the gravel drive while the sky was still gray with pre-dawn light. He brought coffee and legal documents and the kind of focused energy that came from a man trying to make amends for something he could never fully undo. They worked in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Miriam had once sat alone with her bills and her worries. Now the table was covered with photographs, court filings, research notes, and the accumulated evidence of a life spent in quiet, stubborn pursuit of something that mattered. Virgil came by when he could, filling in gaps in the timeline, providing context that only someone who had known Miriam for decades could offer. He told stories about her early years on the property, about her husband, who had died young and left her with a farm she wasn't sure she could run alone. He talked about the drought years, the struggling crops, the gradual decline that had pushed so many other farmers to sell. And he talked about the cellar. She didn't tell me everything, Virgil admitted one afternoon sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Just that she was working on something important, something that might make a difference if she could get it right. Wren listened, absorbing every detail, building a picture of the grandmother she had never really known. Did she ever talk about me? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Virgil was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Sometimes, not often, but when she did, it was always the same. She said you were strong, said the system would try to break you, but you wouldn't let it. She said, he paused, his voice roughening slightly. She said she hoped you would forgive her someday for not being there. Wren looked out at the orchard, the dead trees casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. I spent 12 years hating her, she said quietly. 12 years believing she abandoned me because she didn't care. And the whole time she was down in that cellar working on something she hoped would give me a future. Guilt's a strange thing, Virgil said. It can make you do things that don't make sense to anyone else. Your grandmother carried a lot of it, I think. Guilt about giving you up. Guilt about not being able to fight the system. She poured all of that into her work like she was trying to build something that would make up for everything she couldn't do in person. Wren didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The past was the past, unchangeable and irretrievable. All she could do now was honor what Miriam had built and make sure it didn't disappear into Titan's corporate machinery. The evidence was coming together. Slowly, painfully, but it was coming together. Garrett reached out to the Colorado State University Extension Office requesting a formal evaluation of Miriam's research. The preliminary assessment had been promising, but they needed something more comprehensive, something that would hold up under the scrutiny of Titan's legal team. The response came faster than expected. Dr. Sarah Whitfield arrived at the farmhouse on a Tuesday morning in early May, driving a dusty Subaru with university decals on the bumper. She was younger than Wren had expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct, no-nonsense manner that suggested she didn't have time for games. I've been following agricultural research in drought-prone regions for years, she said, spreading Miriam's notebooks across the kitchen table. When your lawyer contacted me about this project, I thought he was exaggerating. Nobody conducts this kind of sustained independent research anymore. It's too expensive, too time-consuming, too unlikely to produce results. She looked up at Wren, her expression almost awed. Your grandmother proved me wrong. For 3 days, Dr. Whitfield worked through Miriam's documentation, cross-referencing data, examining seed samples, testing soil compositions. She barely slept, barely ate, consumed by the work, in a way that reminded Wren uncomfortably of the grandmother she was only now beginning to understand. On the 4th day, she delivered her verdict. It's legitimate, she said, sitting across from Wren and Garrett in the farmhouse kitchen. More than legitimate, it's groundbreaking. The drought resistance characteristics your grandmother developed are unlike anything I've seen in commercial varieties. If these seeds perform as documented, they could revolutionize apple cultivation in arid regions. Garrett leaned forward, his expression intent. Could you testify to that in court? I can do better than testify. Doctor. Whitfield pulled out a folder from her bag. I've prepared a formal evaluation signed and notarized attesting to the authenticity and scientific merit of the research. I've also reached out to colleagues at other institutions. 3 of them are willing to provide supporting statements. She slid the folder across the table. Your grandmother spent 12 years building something remarkable. I'm not going to let a corporation bury it just because they have more lawyers than she did. Wren looked at the folder, then at Dr. Whitfield, then at Garrett. For the first time since the hearing, she felt something other than fear and exhaustion. She felt hope. But hope, Wren was learning, was a fragile thing, and Titan was not done fighting. The discovery came by accident. Garrett had been digging through county records looking for anything that might strengthen their case. property transfers, agricultural permits, water rights, the endless paper trail that accumulated around any piece of land over decades of ownership. Most of it was a routine, unremarkable, the bureaucratic detritus of rural life. Then he found the lawsuit. He called Wren that evening, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I need you to come to my office. There's something you need to see." Wren drove into town as the sun was setting, the mountains painted in shades of orange and purple that she might have found beautiful under other circumstances. She parked in front of the brick building on Grand Avenue and found Garrett waiting for her, his face grim. "What is it?" she asked as she followed him inside. He didn't answer until they were in his office, the door closed behind them. Then he handed her a sheaf of papers, old and slightly yellowed, the corners soft from years of storage. "This was filed 10 years ago," he said. "I found it buried in the county archives. Someone had misfiled it, probably deliberately, but I've been doing this job for 40 years. I know where to look for things people don't want found." Wren scanned the first page. It was a legal complaint, formal and densely worded, filled with language she didn't fully understand. But some phrases jumped out at her. Intellectual property infringement, unauthorized use of proprietary research, demand for immediate cessation and transfer of all related materials. The plaintiff was Titan Agri Holdings. The defendant was Miriam Holloway. "They sued her," Wren said slowly, the implications sinking in. 10 years ago, they sued my grandmother. They claimed she had stolen research from one of their subsidiary companies, that her drought resistance work was based on proprietary data that belonged to them. Garrett's voice was bitter. It was nonsense, of course, complete fabrication. Miriam had been conducting independent research for years before Titan even entered the region. But that wasn't the point. Wren looked up from the papers. What was the point? Pressure, intimidation. They knew they couldn't win in court, so they filed just enough to force her into a legal battle she couldn't afford. The complaint was eventually withdrawn, supposedly due to insufficient evidence, but by then the damage was done. Garrett pulled out another document. "I found medical records too. Your grandmother's heart condition worsened significantly during the period of the lawsuit. Hospital admissions medication changes a doctor's note recommending she reduce stress and physical activity." He set the paper down heavily. "The timeline matches perfectly. Titan filed their lawsuit, put her through months of legal hell, and her health collapsed under the strain." Wren stared at the documents, her hands trembling, with a rage she could barely contain. "They killed her," she said. "They didn't pull the trigger, but they killed her." "They created the conditions that led to her decline," Garrett agreed quietly. "They harassed an elderly woman living alone on a struggling farm, knowing she didn't have the resources to fight back. They tried to break her, and when that didn't work completely, they withdrew and waited. Waited for her to die. Waited for the property to pass to someone who wouldn't know what they were inheriting." Wren thought about Preston Marsh standing in the dead orchard with his expensive suit and his smooth voice offering her money to walk away. He had known. He had known exactly what his company had done to Miriam, and he had come anyway expecting Wren to sell what her grandmother had died protecting. "Can we use this?" she asked. "In court," Garrett nodded slowly, "it establishes a pattern of behavior. It shows that Titan has been targeting this property for years, using legal harassment as a weapon against your grandmother. It undermines their claim that they're just interested in routine land acquisition." He paused. "It also shows what they're capable of, what they're willing to do to get what they want. The judge needs to understand that we're not just dealing with a corporate land grab. We're dealing with people who drove an old woman to her grave and then tried to take what she left behind." Wren looked at the lawsuit, at the medical records, at the paper trail of her grandmother's final years. The story they told was clear and damning. Miriam hadn't just died of a weak heart. She had died of a broken one, worn down by years of fighting alone against forces too powerful to defeat. But she hadn't given up. Even in the end, even as her health failed and her options narrowed, she had kept working, kept building, kept hoping that someday someone would come to finish what she started. Wren was that someone, and she was going to make sure Titan paid for what they had done. The final hearing was scheduled for the third week of June, exactly 57 days after the preliminary ruling. Wren spent the intervening weeks in a state of focused preparation that left little room for anything else. She reviewed documents with Garrett. She practiced her testimony. She walked the orchard every evening, studying the dead trees, imagining what they might become if the research was validated and the seeds were planted and time was allowed to do its slow, patient work. The farmhouse no longer felt abandoned. It felt like a command center, a base of operations for a battle that had been building for more than a decade. The kitchen table was covered with evidence. The cellar had been organized into a proper archive. The porch where Wren had once sat contemplating surrender now held chairs where she and Garrett and Virgil gathered in the evenings to plan their next moves. They were ready as they could be. The night before the hearing, Wren couldn't sleep. She lay on the couch, the same couch where she had spent her first restless night on the property, and stared at the ceiling while shadows shifted in the lantern light. Tomorrow would determine everything. Tomorrow would decide whether Miriam's work survived or disappeared, whether Wren's inheritance meant something or nothing, whether 12 years of sacrifice had been worth it or wasted. She thought about Miriam working alone in the cellar while the world forgot about her. She thought about the letter, the one that had shattered everything Wren believed about being abandoned. She thought about the photographs Virgil had given her, the images of her grandmother aging year by year, never stopping, never giving up. I believe in you. I always have. Wren closed her eyes and tried to find sleep. Tomorrow she would fight. Tonight she would rest. But rest didn't come easily. The wind moved through the orchard, restless and whispering, and Wren lay awake until the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows. The courtroom in Grand Junction was fuller than it had been for the preliminary hearing. Word had spread, apparently. A young woman fighting a corporation for her grandmother's legacy made for compelling local news, and several reporters had shown up to watch the proceedings. The public gallery held a scattering of observers, some curious, some sympathetic, some simply looking for entertainment on a slow Tuesday morning. Wren sat at the plaintiff's table, Garrett beside her, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Across the aisle, Titan's legal team had expanded. 6 attorneys now instead of 5, their expensive suits and confident expressions unchanged. Preston Marsh sat in the gallery behind them, watching Wren with an expression she couldn't read. The judge entered, the same gray-haired woman from the preliminary hearing, and called the court to order. We are here to determine whether the petitioner, Wren Holloway, has provided sufficient evidence as to support her claim of intellectual property ownership over agricultural research allegedly conducted by her grandmother, Miriam Holloway. The judge's voice was measured, professional. The petitioner was granted 60 days to supplement the evidentiary record. We will now review what has been submitted. Garrett rose to present their case. He started with the photographs. One by one, he introduced the images that Virgil had preserved, each one dated and authenticated. Miriam in the cellar, surrounded by her research. Miriam examining seeds, recording data, conducting the slow and patient work of scientific discovery. These photographs establish a clear timeline, Garrett said, his voice steady. They show Miriam Holloway conducting independent research over a period of more than 12 years. The dates are verifiable. The locations are consistent with the cellar beneath the Holloway farmhouse. The work documented in these images matches the research described in the notebook submitted as evidence. He introduced Virgil's testimony next. The old farmer took the stand, his weathered face uncomfortable under the courtroom lights, his voice rough but clear as he described his decades-long friendship with Miriam, his awareness of her work, his role in preserving the photographic evidence she had entrusted to him. She knew they would come, Virgil said, his pale eyes meeting the judge's. Miriam knew that someday someone would try to take what she had built. So she made plans. She documented everything. She trusted me to hold on to the proof until it was needed. He looked at Wren. And here we are. Titan's attorneys cross-examined him aggressively, questioning his reliability, his memory, his motivations. But Virgil had spent 70 years working the land, dealing with weather and markets, and all the unpredictable challenges of agricultural life. He wasn't easily rattled. He answered every question directly without embellishment, and the attorneys eventually gave up. Dr. Whitfield testified next. She presented her formal evaluation with the precision of someone accustomed to academic scrutiny. The research was legitimate, she explained. The methodology was sound. The results were verifiable and significant. The drought-resistant apple varieties that Miriam had developed represented a genuine scientific achievement, one that could have substantial commercial and environmental value. In my professional opinion, she concluded, Miriam Holloway was the sole author of this research. The documentation is consistent, the timeline is coherent, and the scientific merit is undeniable. Titan's attorneys tried to discredit her too. They questioned her credentials, her objectivity, her relationship with the petitioner. Dr. Whitfield responded to each challenge with calm, factual precision. She was a scientist, not an advocate. She had no stake in the outcome. She was simply reporting what the evidence showed. By the time she finished, even the judge seemed impressed. Then Garrett presented the final piece of evidence. Your Honor, I would like to submit additional documentation that has recently come to light. He held up the papers from the county archives. These records show that Titan Agri Holdings filed a lawsuit against Miriam Holloway approximately 10 years ago, claiming that her research infringed on their proprietary intellectual property. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Titan's lead attorney rose to object, but the judge waved him down. Continue, counselor. The lawsuit was eventually withdrawn due to insufficient evidence, Garrett continued. But during the period it was active, Miriam Holloway's health deteriorated significantly. Medical records from that time show increased hospitalizations, medication adjustments, and physician recommendations to reduce stress. He paused, letting the implications sink in. This establishes a pattern of behavior. Titan has been targeting the Holloway property for years using legal pressure as a tool to force compliance. When Miriam refused to sell, they filed a baseless lawsuit designed to exhaust her resources and break her will. When that failed, they withdrew and waited for her to die. Garrett turned to face Titan's legal team directly. And now they are here again, trying to accomplish through litigation what they could not accomplish through harassment. They are attempting to claim research that they know belongs to Miriam Holloway using the same tactics they used against her a decade ago. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Miriam Holloway conducted independent agricultural research for more than 12 years. She documented her work meticulously. She preserved proof of her authorship against the day when it would be challenged. And she left everything to her granddaughter, Wren Holloway, who is the legitimate owner of that research under the terms of her grandmother's will. He returned to his seat. The petitioner respectfully requests that this court recognize her intellectual property claim and deny any attempt by Titan Agri Holdings to appropriate research that does not belong to them. The courtroom was silent. Titan's lead attorney rose slowly, his confident expression finally showing cracks. Your Honor, these allegations regarding the previous lawsuit are inflammatory and irrelevant. That case was withdrawn years ago. It has no bearing on the current proceedings. On the contrary, the judge said, her voice cool, it establishes context. It suggests that the defendant has a history of aggressive legal tactics against the Holloway property. I will take it under consideration. She reviewed her notes for a long moment. This court finds that the petitioner has provided sufficient evidence to establish a legitimate claim of intellectual property ownership. The photographs, witness testimony, and expert evaluation clearly demonstrate that Miriam Holloway was the sole author of the research in question, and that Wren Holloway, as her designated heir, has rightful ownership of that research. The judge looked at Titan's legal team. The defendant's motion to dismiss is denied. Furthermore, given the evidence of past harassment and the apparent attempt to appropriate research through litigation, this court orders Titan Agri Holdings to cease any and all efforts to acquire the Holloway property or its associated intellectual property through legal or extra-legal means. She picked up her gavel. The petitioner's claim is validated. Ms. Holloway retains full ownership and control of the research developed by her grandmother. Additionally, in light of the documented value of this research and the defendant's clear interest in acquiring it, this court orders Titan Agri Holdings to fund independent testing and development of the drought-resistant varieties documented in the research, with all profits to be shared according to standard licensing agreements negotiated in good faith. The gavel came down. Court is adjourned. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Wren sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Around her, the gallery erupted in murmurs and movement. Reporters scribbled notes. Titan's attorneys gathered their papers with expressions ranging from shock to fury. Preston Marsh rose from his seat and walked out without looking back. Garrett placed a hand on her shoulder. You won, he said quietly. Wren, you won. Right. She looked up at him, her eyes blurring with tears she had been holding back for months. We won, she corrected. All of us, Miriam, Virgil, Dr. Whitfield, you. Garrett smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. Your grandmother would be proud. Wren nodded, unable to speak. She thought about Miriam alone in her cellar, working through the night on research that might never see the light of day. She thought about the letter, the photographs, the decade of patient sacrifice that had led to this moment. She had finished what her grandmother started, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to belong somewhere. Spring came slowly to the high country. The snow on the mountain peaks began to recede, revealing bare rock and early wildflowers. The irrigation ditches ran fuller as the snowmelt made its way down from the heights. The days grew longer, the nights warmer, and the harsh desert cold of winter softened into something almost gentle. Wren spent those weeks working the land. The court victory had provided more than just legal validation. The settlement with Titan included funding for research and development, enough money to hire help, purchase equipment, and begin the slow process of bringing the orchard back to life. Dr. Whitfield had connected Wren with agricultural specialists who understood drought-resistant cultivation. Virgil came by most mornings sharing the knowledge of a lifetime spent working the soil. Not every tree could be saved. The drought had taken too many left, too much damage, created gaps in the rows that would take years to fill. Wren learned to identify which trunks might recover and which were beyond hope. She learned to cut away the dead wood to clear space for new growth, to trust the process even when progress seemed impossibly slow. It was hard work, exhausting work. The kind of work that left her muscles aching and her hands calloused and her mind too tired to think about anything except the next task in front of her. It was also the most meaningful work she had ever done. She was building something. Not just preserving what Miriam had created, but extending it, developing it, turning research into reality. The seeds from the cellar were being tested, cultivated, prepared for planting. The data from the notebooks was being analyzed, verified, incorporated into formal scientific literature. What had once been the private project of a single determined woman was becoming something larger, something that might actually change how people farmed in drought-prone regions. Miriam's work would outlive them all. The morning it happened was ordinary in every way. Late April, the sun just cresting the eastern ridge, the air still cool from the night, but warming quickly as the light spread across the valley. Wren had been up since before dawn, checking irrigation lines, reviewing notes, doing the 100 small tasks that had become her daily routine. She walked out onto the porch with her coffee, the same porch where she had sat on her first night on the property, contemplating surrender and failure, and the $8,000 that had seemed so impossibly generous. That felt like a lifetime ago. She looked out at the orchard, expecting to see the same skeletal branches, the same brown and gray landscape of partial recovery and ongoing work. Instead, she saw white. The coffee cup nearly slipped from her fingers. Along the south row, the row that had received the most attention, the most water, the most careful cultivation over the past months, the trees had bloomed. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough. Clusters of white blossoms had opened overnight, delicate and impossibly beautiful against the backdrop of still bare branches. Wren set down her coffee and walked toward them, her heart pounding. The blossoms were small, fragile, the first tentative signs of life after years of dormancy. They wouldn't produce fruit this season, she knew. It would take more time, more care, more seasons of patient work before the orchard yielded anything resembling a harvest. But they were there. They were real. They were proof that the land could come back, that Miriam's research worked, that all the sacrifice and struggle had been worth something. Wren reached out and touched one of the blossoms, gently afraid it might disappear if she pressed too hard. It stayed. She stood there for a long time, surrounded by white petals, breathing in a scent she had almost forgotten. Sweet and clean, the smell of apple blossoms in spring, the smell of her earliest memories, the smell of the grandmother who had loved her enough to let her go. The wind moved through the orchard, soft and warm, and for the first time it didn't sound hollow. It sounded like music, like laughter, like home. Garrett arrived that afternoon in his truck, kicking up dust as it came down the drive. He had been checking in regularly since the hearing, making sure the legal paperwork was progressing, that Titan was complying with the court orders, that Wren had everything she needed to move forward. But today's visit felt different, more personal. He climbed out of the truck and stopped short, his eyes fixed on the south row. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly. Wren stood beside him, watching his face as he took in the sight of the blossoms. "They bloomed this morning," she said. I came out and they were just there, like magic. Garrett shook his head slowly, his expression somewhere between wonder and grief. Not magic. Work. Your grandmother's work and yours. He paused. She would have loved to see this. I know. They stood in silence for a while, watching the wind move through the blossoming branches. The petals shifted and danced, catching the afternoon light, creating patterns of shadow and brightness that seemed almost alive. I have something for you, Garrett said finally. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. I found it in my files going through old documents from when your grandmother was alive. I think she meant for me to give it to you, but I never knew it existed until I started looking through everything again. He handed her the envelope. It was small, worn at the edges, sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. On the front in Miriam's handwriting was a single word, Wren. Wren's hands trembled as she took it. I'll give you some privacy, Garrett said, and walked back toward the house. Wren sat down on the edge of the irrigation ditch, the envelope in her lap, her heart pounding. She had thought she knew everything now. The letter in the cellar, the photographs, the research, the whole story of what Miriam had done and why. But there was more. There was always more. She opened the envelope carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was inside. A single sheet of paper folded twice the handwriting, shakier than in the other letters. This had been written near the end, Wren realized. When Miriam's hands were failing her heart, giving out her body, surrendering to the years of solitary work. She began to read. My darling Wren, if you're reading this, it means you found the cellar. It means you found the research. It means you didn't give up. I knew you wouldn't. I knew it from the moment you were born, when you looked up at me with those serious eyes that seemed to see right through everything. You were always stronger than you knew, stronger than anyone gave you credit for. I'm writing this because I may not have the chance to say it in person. My heart is failing. The doctors tell me I should rest, but resting feels too much like giving up. And I have never been good at that, neither have you. There are things I couldn't put in the other letter, things that felt too personal, too painful, too close to the wound that never quite healed. I want you to know that I thought about you every single day. Every morning when I woke up, every night when I went to sleep, every moment in between. I wondered what you were doing, whether you were happy, whether you were safe. I wondered if you hated me, and I accepted that you probably did. I would have hated me too in your position, but I also hoped. I hoped that someday, somehow you would understand. Not forgive, maybe. Forgiveness might be too much to ask. But understand, I didn't choose to leave you. I chose to give you a chance. Those are not the same things, even though they feel identical from the outside. The system told me you would be better off without a sick, broke, aging grandmother dragging you down. Maybe they were right. Maybe you did have better opportunities in foster care than you would have had here struggling alongside me on a dying farm. But opportunities aren't the same as love. And I have loved you every single day since the moment I let you go. The research was my way of holding on to you. Every seed I documented, every experiment I ran, every page I wrote in those notebooks was a message to a future I might not live to see. I was building something for you, a legacy, a foundation, a reason to come back. And you came back. Even if I'm not there to see it, I know you came back. Because you're reading this letter, which means you found the cellar, which means you didn't take the easy way out. You fought. I am so proud of you. I don't know what will happen after I'm gone. I don't know if Titan will succeed in taking everything or if you'll find a way to stop them. I don't know if the research will matter or if it will disappear into some corporate vault where no one will ever see it again. But I know this, whatever happens, you are my legacy, not the seeds, not the data, not the orchard. You. You are the reason I kept going when everything told me to stop. You are the proof that love can survive even the longest separations. You are the answer to every doubt I ever had about whether any of this was worth it. It was worth it. You are worth it. Live well, my darling girl. Plant orchards. Build things that matter. Love fiercely and forgive generously, and never ever let anyone tell you that you're not enough. You are more than enough. You always have been. All my love forever, your grandmother. So, Wren sat by the irrigation ditch for a long time after she finished reading the letter, clutched in her hands, tears streaming down her face. The sun moved across the sky. The wind rustled through the blossoming trees. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its voice clear and sweet in the afternoon air. She thought about Miriam writing this letter in her final days, her hands shaking her heart, failing, pouring every ounce of love and hope she had left onto a single sheet of paper. She thought about all the years between them, the silence and the separation and the story of abandonment that Wren had carried like armor. The armor was gone now, stripped away piece by the truth of what Miriam had done, what she had sacrificed, what she had built. Wren folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. She would keep it forever. She would read it whenever she doubted herself, whenever the work seemed too hard, whenever the past tried to pull her back into the story of being unwanted. She had been wanted. She had been loved. She had been thought about and planned for and worked toward for more than a decade. And now it was her turn to build something. Virgil arrived at sunset. He pulled his battered pickup alongside Garrett's truck and climbed out slowly, his joints stiff from the long drive. He walked to where Wren stood at the edge of the orchard, her face still showing traces of tears, her eyes fixed on the blossoming trees. "Garrett called," he said. "Told me I should see this." They stood together in silence, watching the last light of day paint the blossoms gold and pink. "She did it," Virgil said finally. "After everything, she actually did it." Wren nodded. "We all did. You, Garrett, everyone who helped." "No," Virgil shook his head, his pale eyes serious. "Miriam did the work. We just made sure it didn't get lost." He was right, Wren knew. The credit belonged to Miriam, to her stubbornness and patience and refusal to give up, even when giving up would have been so much easier. Everything that had happened since the legal battle, the evidence gathering, the victory in court, was just the final chapter of a story that had begun in a hidden cellar more than a decade ago. "What are you going to do now?" Virgil asked. Wren looked out at the orchard, at the white blossoms, catching the last light, at the rows that still needed work, and the trees that still needed planting, and the years of patient effort that lay ahead. "Finish what she started," she said. "Grow apples. Prove the research works at scale. Maybe help other farmers who are struggling with drought do the same thing." She turned to face him. "And make sure nobody forgets her name. What she did here, what she sacrificed, it should matter. It should be remembered." Virgil nodded slowly, approval in his weathered face. "She'd like that." Garrett walked out from the house, his hands in his pockets, and joined them at the edge of the orchard. The three of them stood together as the sun sank behind the mountains, watching the sky turn from gold to orange to deep purple. "I owed Miriam a fight," Garrett said quietly. "I gave up on her 10 years ago, and I've carried that with me ever since. But standing here now, seeing this," he gestured at the blossoming trees, "I think maybe I've finally paid that debt." Wren reached out and took his hand. Then she reached for Virgil's. They stood linked together, three people who had been brought together by a woman who had died alone, but whose love had outlasted her, whose work had survived, whose legacy was blooming in front of them, in shades of white and pink and gold. "Thank you," Wren said, "both of you, for believing in her, for believing in me." Virgil squeezed her hand, his grip rough and warm. "Thank your grandmother. She did the believing. We just showed up." The stars were coming out now, scattered across the darkening sky like scattered blossoms of their own. The wind moved through the orchard, carrying the sweet scent of apple flowers, carrying memories and hopes, and the quiet promise of seasons to come. Wren stood in the orchard her grandmother had tended, surrounded by people who had become family, and felt something she hadn't felt since she was 6 years old. She felt home. The months that followed were full of work and growth and the slow transformation that happens when people commit to building something together. The orchard didn't recover overnight. Some trees never came back, their roots too damaged, their trunks too hollow, their connection to the land severed beyond repair. But others responded to the care and attention, putting out new growth, extending branches toward the sun, reaching for a future they could finally see. Wren learned to read the trees the way Miriam must have learned, understanding their needs, their rhythms, the subtle signs of health and distress that came from paying close attention over time. She worked alongside hired hands and volunteers and researchers from the university, building a network of people who believed in what Miriam had created. The research expanded beyond the original notebooks. Dr. Whitfield published papers. Other institutions requested seed samples for their own trials. Slowly, steadily, the drought-resistant varieties that Miriam had developed began to spread, taking root in test plots across the western states, proving their worth in conditions that would have killed conventional orchards. It wasn't revolution, it was evolution. The slow, patient kind that happened when good work was given time to grow. Wren thought about that often in the quiet moments between tasks. She thought about Miriam working alone in her cellar, knowing she might not live to see the results of her labor. She thought about the faith it took to plant something you might never harvest, to build something you might never use. That was the real legacy, she realized. Not the seeds, not the data, not even the orchard itself. It was the belief that some things were worth doing even if you didn't get to see them finished. The understanding that love could take forms other than presents, that sacrifice could be a gift, that letting go could be the hardest and most generous thing a person ever did. Miriam had understood that. She had lived it every day for 12 years, and now Wren understood it too. Yeah. On the first anniversary of her arrival at the orchard, Wren walked among the trees at sunset. The blossoms were gone now, replaced by small green fruits that would ripen through the summer and fall. Not a full harvest, not yet, but the beginning of one. Proof of concept, evidence that the work was paying off. She carried the letter with her, the final one, the one Garrett had found. She had read it so many times that the paper was soft from handling the folds worn thin. But she still needed to see it sometimes. Still needed to remind herself of where she had come from and why she was here. You are my legacy, not the seeds, not the data, not the orchard. You. Wren stopped at the end of the south row where the first blossoms had appeared, where the strongest trees stood. She knelt down and pressed her palm against the soil, feeling the warmth of the day, slowly fading the coolness of evening, rising up from the earth. I finished it, she said quietly. What you started. I finished it. The wind moved through the leaves, a soft rustling that sounded almost like a response. I understand now. Why you did what you did. Why you let me go. Wren's voice caught. I hated you for so long. I thought you abandoned me, but you didn't. You just loved me in a way I couldn't see until I was ready. She stood up, wiping her eyes. I'm ready now. I'm going to keep building, keep growing, keep making sure your work matters. She looked up at the sky where the first stars were appearing. And I forgive you. I forgive everything. I love you. I always did, even when I thought I hated you. And I'll love you for the rest of my life. The orchard was silent, peaceful, alive in a way it hadn't been for years. Wren turned and walked back toward the farmhouse where lights glowed warm in the windows, and the smell of dinner drifted out into the evening air. She had people waiting for her now. A community, a purpose, a home. Behind her, the trees rustled in the wind, their branches heavy with the promise of fruit to come. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched Miriam work alone in her cellar, the same stars that had witnessed Wren's first desperate night on the property. The story that had begun with loss and separation and 12 years of misunderstanding had become something else, something about resilience and forgiveness and the stubborn persistence of love. Some stories end with closure, with neat resolutions and final answers, in the sense that everything has been explained. This story ended with a beginning, with small green apples ripening in the summer sun, with a young woman learning to tend the land her grandmother had loved, with the understanding that some wounds take generations to heal and some gifts take lifetimes to understand. Wren Holloway had come to the orchard homeless, angry, and convinced she had been abandoned. She had found something else entirely. She had found roots,